Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, on this Halloween weekend, some of you might be frightened by the elections. The bad news is that there are more screams ahead in the next week and a half. We'll look tonight at the latest in the local campaigning, including what the polls say, an upcoming debate, a silent challenger in the 2nd Congressional District, and a slate of amendments. Our Future Watch segment looks at changes in the local cruise industry. And this Tuesday is the 50th anniversary of New Orleans being awarded an NFL franchise. We'll look at some of the behind-the-scenes stories. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jeremy Alford, publisher, LaPolitics.com. Don Ostron, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. We'll go over to Jeremy to get started on this political discussion, and let's now talk polls. What are they looking like for the Senate race?
Right, so we got a poll out of Florida, Market Research Insight, Southern Media and Opinion Research out of Baton Rouge, UNO here in New Orleans, and all show a probability of an all-Republican runoff. And this is something that we've all discussed in passing in the past, just like we have about the possibility of an all-Democratic runoff and a R versus a D. But, these folks are really bunched up on top. I mean, out of those 3 polls, you got John Kennedy with a pretty healthy lead. You got Charles Boustany and Foster Campbell, if not tied, within the margin of error of being, right on top of each other, duking it out for that other runoff spot. And it really creates some interesting dynamics in this race moving forward, one of which is on the Democratic side between Foster Campbell and Carolyn Fayard. While Campbell has pulled out ahead, there's only one place he can grow, and that's with Carolyn Fayard's base. And that means, to put it not so gently, he's going to have to light her up to get some of those votes. And we've seen some of those attacks already start. And at the same time, you got Charles Boustany, who's sitting there wondering if Foster Campbell's going to get ahead of him by really consolidating the black voting base in Louisiana. And does Charles Boustany then open up on Foster Campbell? And the answer is yes. And it started today with the email talking about that Foster Campbell's going to have to wear his tap dancing shoes and explain what's going on with Hillary Clinton.
So we're, about 10 days away now from the election? And you see the polls are kind of shaken out to reflect sort of similar things. What do candidates now need to do, particularly these ones that are really bunched up, to break through?
They need to convert new votes. They need.
How do they do that?
And John Kennedy in particular needs to maintain what he has, and that's going to be hard for him because, like we said last week, he's a political pinata, and everybody's going to take a swing at him. Foster Campbell has got to build his base, and the only way he can do that is to go after the Democrats that are with Carolyn Fayard. He's got about 10% of the white vote, almost exclusively from North Louisiana. And Charles Boustany, too, is the choice of second choice votes is less clear on the Republican side. For Democrats, it either goes to Campbell or it goes to Fayard. With Republicans, if one person loses votes, the other two have an equal chance of grabbing those votes as they fall down. So it's a little more complicated on the Republican side, a little bit more nuanced. But that's what has to happen. Somebody has to stand out, and somebody needs to try to gain a little bit of momentum.
I think a lot of people were looking at the governor's election last year, where you had a big field of Republicans and one Democrat, and seeing that as the model for the campaign, which allowed John Bel Edwards to get into the runoff. Could we say that if Fayard wasn't running, that Foster Campbell would
no question.
Would be automatic? And could we say that if Campbell wasn't running, that Fayard would be there?
About 40% of the voters in this state, give or take, are going to go for a Democrat in a vacuum, just an R versus D. So 40% gets you in a runoff, certainly in a crowded field. The question is, if you have 20 and 20, then that might be enough, might not be enough for either of them, depending on what's happening on the Republican side. And you were talking about Campbell really having to expand his base by going for Fayard's voters. Boy, is she going after his voters right now. I mean, they are really, I'm going to say, duking it out because they are using David Duke as a weapon all of a sudden. And it's caused a lot of controversy. Caroline Fayard has an ad that basically links Foster Campbell to David Duke, which is toxic in for someone who's going after black voters, certainly. And in a way that I will tell you, I was at the forum that the ad is about, the Alliance for Good Government Forum, and it's really misleading. It really takes a line he said where he said, "I'm like David Duke." But what he was talking about was he's answering a question kind of the way David Duke answered a question. He wasn't saying, "I'm like him" in any way, meaningful way. Nobody in the room took it that way. And so she has this ad running. He's very angry. The Alliance has now pulled its endorsement because the rules were that nobody was supposed to record, and there is a recording that's part of this ad. So
she said, "I don't want your endorsement anyway." Then.
She said, "Yeah, you're trying to censor me. I don't want it anyway." But I think it really just shows what a zero-sum game it is between the two of them, and tensions are very high.
Well, the poll that I referred to earlier, Market Research Insight, is Vern Kennedy out of Florida, and he had pretty good numbers on the governor's race last year. And if you delve deep into these numbers, you'll find that when it comes to African American voters, Campbell has 24%. Fayard is right behind him with 23%. Just a point separates them, and that's a much closer margin than we've seen in other recent polls. And it shows just how I think tense it's going to get, and we're going to talk about this later. But that debate next week is going to be primetime fireworks.
Well, let's get to it right now. Let's talk about that debate. That comes up on Wednesday here in New Orleans at Dillard University with an interesting slate.
And I think this is the poll you didn't mention, the Raycom poll, which is another that had similar results overall, but Raycom is a network of television stations, including WYES here in New Orleans, and they decided ahead of time that anyone who scored above 5% in their poll would make the cut. So it's the usual the five we've been seeing this whole campaign, and David Duke, who just eked in with 5.1%. So all of a sudden, there's David Duke in a televised debate at a historically black university. So it's
standing between two Democrats who are using him as a device to attack each other.
Right. So I think it's going to get good ratings. I think it's going to get outside media attention. I think it's going to be tricky for the moderators to handle. John Snell is moderating. He's very good, obviously.
He is very good. John really does handle that well.
Does.
It won't be the first gubernatorial debate he's moderated with David Duke.
Yes.
Well, this one's senatorial, right?
Yeah. Oh, senatorial, I'm sorry.
Statewide.
Right. So what do you think, what do you guys envision coming out of this debate? Once again, these are the last days. People have to distinguish themselves. They have to get into, right now they're fighting for the second position because Kennedy seems to be at the top.
But also you have, again, as Jeremy said, the three Republicans really going after each other and the two Democrats really going after each other, and some cross-pollination because, as you said, Boustany would like to probably help Fayard out at this point to knock Campbell down. But those voters aren't going to go to Boustany, they just might go to Fayard. But, the Republican side is interesting too, because if we do end up in this two Republican runoff scenario, and if it's Kennedy versus Boustany, where do the Democrats go? That's the interesting question. And neither one of them really, I think, is obviously the more conservative. So there's not...
John Kennedy used to be a Democrat.
He used to be a John Kerry supporter, as you hear all the time. Boustany of the Republicans is probably the one who has more of a history of bipartisanship, so they attack him for that sometimes. So these things that have been a negative to Republicans can also be a positive to Democrats. So it would be a really interesting runoff, I think.
I think the other thing that comes out of this race is, or the debate, is that I think it's going to play differently in New Orleans than it does in most parts of the state, because a lot of people in New Orleans aren't familiar with these candidates, except for David Duke, and they don't want to vote for him.
And maybe John Kennedy.
But like, for people in other parts of the state, it's their congressman. You have two congressmen running, but they're not well-known congressmen in the New Orleans area. And so I think to a lot of people who've ruled out David Duke, unless they were Kennedy, are still trying to figure, who are these people?
That's one of the storylines of this. You have three of the major candidates who are from neither of the two big media markets in this state. Foster Campbell and the two congressmen. If you say Baton Rouge and New Orleans are where more of the people are, these are not their guys, like you said.
So we really haven't talked about John Fleming at all, but we've seen in this market a lot of spots. At least I've been seeing a lot of spots for John Fleming. What's happened with his campaign?
He's definitely taken a dip. As John Kennedy's unfavorables have decreased as well. But he put a lot of emphasis in New Orleans and on Jefferson Parish. He opened an office down here. He spent a lot of money on media. But he took a couple of hits on the conservative side. One from Rob Maness, who accused Fleming supporter, trying to get him to drop out of the race. And I think really too, if you look at the Shreveport market, these last few polls that we've seen, Foster Campbell is actually doing better in the Shreveport market than John Fleming has. And this isn't just one poll that shows that. This is, a handful of polls.
Even though it's a very conservative area in general.
And he's had part of his base taken away from him. And if there's anything I learned from this cycle, I think it's that Acadiana is serious business to have as a base. Scott Angel used it to almost make it to the runoff last year. Charles Bustani is using it to really start to gain some momentum. If you can galvanize.
In the lieutenant governor's race, it was.
Sure. Billy Nungesser put a big focus there. But if you can galvanize the Texas line all the way up to the outskirts of the Baton Rouge region, that's really something powerful to go into a statewide election with.
So it's looking like tight race, particularly for the number 2 spot. Does that kind of surprise you that it would be Republican instead of Republican-Democrat?
We've seen that regionally in some congressional races and some lieutenant governor elections, but that's the beauty of the jungle primary, right? Is anything could happen.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll be talking about it again next week. Thanks a lot. Let's go on over to Errol now. We're going to sort of shift gears a little bit because we are observing a special anniversary this Tuesday.
Yeah, and actually this topic is not a departure from politics either. What's happening Tuesday is the 50th anniversary of New Orleans being awarded an NFL franchise that happened 50 years ago. The place where it held was kind of surprising. It was at the Pontchartrain Hotel, and of all the big hotels in New Orleans with the big ballrooms, it was in the Caribbean Room at the Pontchartrain Hotel. And if you're familiar with the Caribbean Room, the back room, they were alongside this wall, which wasn't very big. So you had all these important people crammed. And this is a wonderful picture. I just love this shot right there. In the foreground behind the microphone is Pete Rozelle, who was there to announce it that day. This is huge news for New Orleans. To the left is Moon Landrieu, who was not mayor yet. He was councilman at large, but he was also a member of the Superdome Commission. And then to our right, to Roselle's left, that's Hale Boggs, who may be the most important person in this story, because the story is that year the old National Football League and the American Football League had united, but there was all kind of antitrust questions, and Pete Rozelle wanted antitrust protection from Congress. So part of the deal was that if you can help us with that, we can get you a franchise. And Hale Boggs was the House Majority Leader, and the Senate Majority Leader was Russell Long. So the two majority leaders were powerful politicians from Louisiana. And so not like any deals were made or anything, okay? But it was sort of implied. I mean, Hale Boggs was blatant. I mean, you read the transcripts that Pete Rozelle is in Congress, and he says, how's my bill? How's it coming? And Hale Boggs would say, how's my team? How's they coming? And then next at the end was John McKithen, who was governor, who was a very good governor for Louisiana, very, very supportive of the Superdome. Yeah. And this was really, I was thinking about this was really a good crowd of people between Landrieu and Hale Boggs and John McKithen. We couldn't have the right people in place. It's like what they say about the Constitution, that it was amazing that you really had some good people in place at the right time. But anyway, the announcement was made that day. The team did not have an owner yet. It wouldn't be until December that Rozelle would pick John Meekum from Houston. And so all that happened that day was a franchise was awarded. It didn't have a name yet either. The fact that they chose to do this on All Saints Day kind of gave an indication of what the thinking was, but it wasn't definite. They wanted to wait until they got an owner. And Dave Dixon, who was really the driving force behind all this, loved to tell the story. Dixon strongly favored the name Saints. And when John Meekum became the owner, he was a little reluctant. He thought it might be considered to be sacrilegious. And so Dixon told the story that one day he was in a restaurant and he saw Archbishop Hannon. And he said, excuse me, Bishop, let me ask you a question. And he told him that, we're thinking about calling it the Saints. Meekum thinks that's sacrilegious. What do you think? And the bishop said, well, that's fine. He says, plus, I have a premonition that they may need all the help they can get. And so with that, the franchise was awarded.
That's really, really a great story and a wonderful picture. So that was 50 years ago, the franchise awarded. And then when was the owner determined? When did Meekum become the owner?
That December. And then the team started. And it's actually, to me, next year is the real 50th anniversary of the Saints in terms of their first game, because their first game would have been in September. So actually, we have two 50th anniversaries coming up here. And so in September of 1967. And of course, another part of the deal. And I'm not saying that New Orleans would not have gotten it without the help of Boggs and Long, even though they insisted. But the other thing is that they promised that they'd build a new dome stadium. At the time, there was one dome stadium in the world, and that was the Astrodome. And New Orleans promised one that would be bigger and better. And it was true. I mean, the Astrodome barely survives today. Its usefulness ran out a long time ago. There have been some dome stadiums that were built from scratch since the Superdome, like the King Dome in Seattle, the Humphrey Dome in Minneapolis, that were just pancaked. I mean, they were bad buildings, but New Orleans did it big. They spent a lot of money on it, but they did it right, and it survived, and no one's talking about getting rid of it. So that was one thing we did right. And the other thing is that we placed it downtown, which was a brilliant decision.
Really important for the economy of the city, for the culture of the city,
really
the entertainment of the city.
Yeah, and it kind of took a while for that whole downtown area to really gel the way people envision. But you certainly started to see the payoff all these years later. With the arena next door, and you really are finally starting to see a sports and entertainment area develop around the Superdome.
And a whole neighborhood too.
Yeah,
it's just really an icon on our landscape as well.
So I think a lot of things that people thought might happen in a year or so took almost 50 years, but you're seeing it. But I look at the whole saga though as New Orleans is doing something right. The only thing, whenever I think about this, that I regret is that we're not powerful like we were back then.
I know.
And back then we had 8 congressmen. Now we have 6. And who'd be our most powerful? Well, I guess Steve Scalise.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, but it's not like the same thing.
We're going to have very junior senators next
Yeah.
year, I'll say, too.
We may have Cedric Richmond, though, with the chairman of the Black Caucus.
That's true.
All right. Well, good story about our Saints and also the Superdome. Let's go back over to Stephanie now. And on the ballot, people are going to be facing, once again, constitutional amendments.
Yes.
So we're advised, do your homework, pay attention to what
Eat
this
your
is.
vegetables, although I like vegetables, so I hesitate to compare them to vegetables.
Oh, yeah, I like vegetables too. Stephanie's going to give us a bit of a lesson right now in the amendments.
There are 6 of them, and as usual, some of them are very technical, some of them don't affect a lot of people. Let's run through them very quickly. Number 1 is whether to establish new requirements for people who are registrars of voters, education requirements, professional requirements, things like that. Number 2 is the one that's really gotten the most attention, and this one involves tuition, involves state colleges, so of course a lot of people have an interest in that. Basically, it would give the universities the ability to set tuition without going through the legislature. And right now, Louisiana is one of very few states that requires the legislature to do that. It's the only state that requires 2/3 of the legislature. And the feeling from the higher ed community is it's very politicized. It makes it very difficult, certainly in this era of shortages of funding, to offer what they need to offer. And the downside, so a lot of good government groups support it. A lot of legislators support. Newspapers supported things like that. There's some concern among people who maybe advocate for lower income people that it would mean higher tuitions and it would kind of exacerbate the haves versus have-nots situation we have now with TOPS, where, if you're on TOPS, then tuition, basically, if tuition goes up, historically, that's not necessarily going to happen in the future, but if tuition goes up, then your TOPS award goes up. So, if you're on TOPS, you might be okay, and if the universities with TOPS are okay, but the ones that don't have a lot of students on TOPS suffer.
Is there some sort of check on that, or are universities just sort of freewheeling, able to raise their tuition?
They will say the market is the check on it. They will say if they price themselves out of business, then they're not going to get the income they need. So,
you talk to university administrators, and they're aware of that. It's like business people making marketing decisions, how much you sell your product for, and so.
And right now, they really feel like it's very politicized. Obviously, it's hard for legislators to take those votes, and it has hurt them. I mean,
it's a very important amendment, though.
It is. Yes.
I mean, of all the 6 of them, I think this is by far the most important.
It certainly affects the most people, I think.
Okay, number 4.
Number 3.
Number 3. I jumped on.
This is one, okay, we're going to be hearing so much about tax reform in the next year, and a lot of it's going to be very technical. This is one that, again, has a lot of institutional support. It doesn't affect that many people. Only corporations that file their taxes as corporations, not LLCs, things like that. So it's a swap almost, that if they would lose their federal income tax deduction. In exchange, the tax rate would be leveled, would become even, and in many cases go down.
Flat tax rate in exchange.
6.5%.
Yeah.
And the argument is, Louisiana has high tax rates, which hurt it when companies are looking to do business here, but it also has so many exemptions that we don't get the collections that the rates would reflect. So it's kind of a lose-lose.
Okay.
So this is part of a larger effort to take care of that.
Number 4.
Number 4, again, this doesn't affect a lot of people. This is, it would basically eliminate property taxes for surviving spouses of people, first responders, and military killed in the line of duty.
All right, number 5.
Number 5, and I'm going to
I'll note that number 5 is also the only place in the ballot where you can associate the word trust with Louisiana politics.
Okay.
So noted.
5 and 6 in the weeds, I'm going to say. Number 5 would create a revenue stabilization trust fund, it's called, with revenue from oil and gas, excess revenue, which we don't have right now. We probably won't have for a long time. But the idea is, in the future, if the price goes up and we get a lot of revenues, that money would be put aside and
save it.
Save it, yes. And we have
Stash it
other
away.
things like this. This would be another one.
Okay.
And you could only use it for retirement debt, unfunded
Yeah.
accrued liability,
And infrastructure.
but there would be a trigger for emergency.
Right.
Lawmakers could get into it for an emergency, and I guess the fun part is going to be what is
What is
emergency?
an
What is
emergency?
the
Yes,
emergency?
right.
Okay, let's get to 6 real
Right.
quick before we run it. Well,
And
we are already over.
6 is almost the flip side of that. It would create the ability for lawmakers to go into some protected funds that they can't now. And again, this is part of a larger debate over whether really we need to deal with this on a holistic level.
Errol,
But
you
this
had
is
a quick note?
Yeah, if you read the wording on the ballot, you're going to have no idea what they're talking
No
about.
idea.
It is very thick and complicated wording. So familiarize
There's a
beforehand.
good analysis on the PAR website, Public Affairs Research Council, also on Cable Council for a Better Louisiana. So do some
The wording on the
Googling.
ballot may as well be in Latin, so it's just terrible.
So do your homework.
Yes.
Okay, let's go on over to Don. Thanks, Stephanie.
Sure.
Cruise ships.
Cruise ships, we are on track in New Orleans area to top 2015's record-setting year for cruise ship passengers. So 2015 set a record. 2016 is on track to even beat that record. 2015, we saw 1,023,700 passengers come through the city of New Orleans. Expected to finish stronger this year because of newer and larger home-ported ships. There are 3 ships that call New Orleans their home port. That means they start and finish their 7, 4, or 5-day itineraries in New Orleans. 2 of them are Carnival ships that are here year-round. The third is the Norwegian Cruise Lines. That is returning in November. So next month it returns for its 7-day cruises from here. And there have also been more ships making port calls to New Orleans. They come in for a day or 2 days. One of them was in last month, the Europa 2, which is a luxury cruise ship out of Europe, mostly German-based. There are 2 other German-based ships, Ida Vida, which is going to call 4 overnight calls between now and the end of the year. There are 10 more overnight calls before the year's up. And the port tells me they're always looking at potential expansion, talking about getting Royal Caribbean, which has been gone now from home ported here for 2 years, getting them back, and looking at expanding into the Poland Avenue area, that wharf, turning it into a cruise terminal. Mm-hmm. That's it's always been on the long-range plan, and they say they won't do any work there until the market actually demands it, till they have, signed on the dotted line with a cruise ship company that's coming in. But an indication that is getting closer is that work is starting to happen on Poland Avenue, and it's subsurface shoring up the wharf there, new access road, that sort of thing. Not a build out to suit any particular customer's needs yet, but if you remember when they were constructing Crescent Park, even along that area of the river, there was a lot of subsurface shoring up the stability of the land there that needed to happen. So that substructure work is going on right now. New Orleans got 2 really good rankings out of cruise write-ups. There's one called Cruise Critic that ranked New Orleans the best American home port. There's one out of Porthole Cruise magazine making us the friendliest home port. So the business is good, and it's only getting better. And with increased European travel to our airport, that will only increase the cruise business out of here,
New
too.
Orleans is a great place to come.
And we also have the river cruises,
The
too.
new
That's what
river
shows.
cruise that opened up, we talked about a couple weeks ago.
I think it's this weekend, the one out of Gretna, Louisiana. So that industry got a little bit dormant, the river cruise, but I think we're starting to see
And the
more life
Natchez
in
is
that.
adding a new boat, too. The company that runs the Natchez, just port cruises, is getting another ship soon, too.
Good news for those of us who live here, too. Some good choices.
Yes.
You can go on some nice vacations right from home. Stephanie, real quick. Silent candidate in the 2nd Congressional.
This is the weird one because we have two major figures in this state running against each other, both Democrats, incumbent Cedric Richmond, outgoing Baton Rouge Mayor Kip Holden, longstanding major figure on the scene, qualified to run and has done almost nothing since, and has raised no money. His website still says, or at least as of last week, it said he was running for lieutenant governor, which he did last year, and yet he says he's in it to win it. He says he's happy that Cedric is feeling confident because then he's going to come hit him, and we're 10 days away, did we say?
Are there any polls that have been done on this race?
Not that I know of. There is a debate, actually, a forum on Monday at the Press Club up in Baton Rouge, so that will really be kind of the only campaign activity at all.
It's on Halloween. It's on Halloween day.
Yes. And meanwhile, Cedric Richmond has been off campaigning for Hillary Clinton, know, and he, like you said, he is positioning himself to run for head of the Congressional Plaid Caucus. He is certainly not acting as if he has a major opponent, and he doesn't. It's just kind of strange because this could have been a very interesting race, and they're both very interesting, well-established politicians. One Baton Rouge, one New Orleans, and you can't have a clash of the Titans if only one of the Titans shows up.
Right.
And
But he's just been really quiet.
He's been quiet.
Just not
We've had this crazy summer in Baton Rouge of tragedies, and he's gotten a lot of criticism from his own constituents for how he's handled that. He's gone to Taiwan. He's gone to Panama. We don't know. And meanwhile, the election to replace him is happening, and probably nobody would really notice, except that he's going for this big office.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie.
Okay.
Time to look ahead.
Last week we talked about the sudden emergence of nonstop international flights from New Orleans. Last week we talked about the new flight from London. Today another one was announced. An airline, a Central American Airlines called Choice Airlines, announced that starting in December they're going to have twice weekly nonstop service to San Pedro Sula in Honduras. That used to be a route out of New Orleans that was really lost to Houston. So it's good to see nonstop service between here. It'll be a 737, which if you fly Southwest Airlines, that's the kind of planes that Southwest uses. And so that starts in December.
Great. Jeremy.
It's a big week for legislative news. Next week, we're going to have the report from the Budget and Reform Task Force for recommendations in the 2017 session, and we're also going to see the initial plans for dealing with this $300+ million deficit from last fiscal year starting to come together.
Always great news, huh? Okay.
Could make you groan or gleeful, but November 22nd, which is only just a few weeks away at this point, is the downtown lighting ceremony, Christmas lighting ceremony at the Astor Crown Plaza from 5 to 7. November 22nd.
It's come around really
here we
quickly,
go.
hasn't it? Yes,
Yes.
indeed. Steph.
It gets overshadowed this time of year because we have football and we have the World Series, but basketball has started again. The Pelicans are back. Regular season started this week. If you go, I went Wednesday. They lost. It was still fun. You won't recognize anybody except Anthony Davis, but boy, did he have a great game.
And if you need to find out about the Pelicans, ask Stephanie because she knows
Yes.
her basketball. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources.